There is someone in your life right now who almost never picks up the phone, who declines most invitations, who sits alone at lunch by choice, and who somehow seems more at peace than anyone else in the room. You have probably watched them and wondered what is going on inside their head. You may have even felt sorry for them, assumed something was broken in them, or quietly labeled them antisocial. But what if everything you assumed about that person was completely wrong? What if the quiet ones, the ones who pull back from the noise of constant socializing, are actually operating at a level most of us have never even considered? Today, we are going to take a deep, honest look at the hidden psychology of people who rarely socialize, and what we are about to uncover might make you question everything you thought you knew about connection, intelligence, and what it actually means to thrive as a human being. When someone chooses not to socialize, the world is very quick to attach a label: antisocial, awkward, depressed, lonely. These words get thrown around casually as if pulling away from social gatherings is automatically a sign of something wrong. But psychology tells a completely different story. Researchers have spent decades studying human social behavior, and one of the most consistent findings in the field is that the motivation behind social withdrawal matters enormously. There is a world of difference between someone who avoids people because they are afraid and someone who avoids people because they simply do not need the stimulation. One is avoidance rooted in fear. The other is a deliberate, conscious choice rooted in self-awareness. Confusing the two is one of the most common mistakes society makes about quiet people. And it is a mistake that carries real consequences. Because when we misread the reason someone is alone, we misread everything about who they are. The science of introversion sits within the Big Five personality model, one of the most widely used frameworks for understanding human personality. Within this model, introversion is not a flaw or a disorder, but a stable orientation toward one's inner life. People on the introverted end of the spectrum are energized by reflection and internal dialogue rather than by external interaction. Where an extroverted person might feel restless after a long evening alone, the introverted person often feels depleted and overstimulated after a long social event. This is not drama. This is neuroscience, and it starts with a single brain chemical called dopamine. Dopamine is the neurotransmitter most associated with pleasure, motivation, and reward. Research has found that extroverts and introverts process it differently. Extroverts appear to have a more reactive dopamine system, meaning they need more external stimulation to feel that rewarding surge of energy, which is why they gravitate towards social situations, loud environments, and constant activity. Introverts tend to be more sensitive to dopamine. They do not need as much of it to feel satisfied. A quiet afternoon of reading, a solo walk, or one deeply meaningful conversation is often enough to produce a sense of fullness that no crowded party ever could. This is not a flaw in the system. It is simply a different operating system, one the world rarely stops long enough to understand. Researchers at Carleton University who studied the motivations behind social withdrawal identified three distinct groups. The first withdraws due to shyness, which is rooted in anxiety and fear of negative evaluation. The second withdraws due to unsociability, meaning they simply prefer solitary activities and find them more rewarding. The third withdraws due to social avoidance associated with active discomfort around others and elevated anxiety. The finding that surprises most people is this: the unsociable group, the ones who chose solitude simply because they preferred it, reported levels of life satisfaction comparable to people who were not withdrawn at all. Choosing to be alone because you genuinely want to be alone is a fundamentally different experience from being alone, because the world feels too frightening to enter. One is freedom, the other is a cage. And the entire conversation about people who rarely socialize falls apart the moment we stop treating those two things as the same. This brings us to one of the most quietly radical ideas in modern psychology, the concept of solitude as a skill, not a last resort. Not a consolation prize for people who struggle to make friends, a genuine, learnable skill. Researchers at Durham University who run the Solitude Lab have drawn a sharp and important line between solitude and loneliness. Loneliness is the painful experience of unwanted aloneness, the feeling of being disconnected from the world against your will. Solitude is something else entirely. It is chosen, deliberate, intentional time alone. It is the experience of being with yourself on your own terms. And when people learn to inhabit it well, the benefits are remarkable. Studies show that people who actively choose and enjoy solitude report higher levels of emotional regulation. They have spent more time inside their own emotional landscape and developed a more sophisticated understanding of how their inner world works. Think about what that means. While everyone else has been outsourcing their emotional processing to group chats and social events, the person sitting quietly alone has been doing the interior work. They have been building something invisible but enormously powerful. That is not isolation. That is investment. Beyond that, people who inhabit solitude tend to develop a stronger and more stable sense of personal values. Because they are not constantly calibrating their behavior to a group, they have more opportunity to hear their own instincts clearly. They make decisions that reflect who they actually are rather than who the room needs them to be. This shows up as a quality of calm that people around them often notice without being able to name. There is an ease to someone who is genuinely comfortable in their own company. It reads as confidence, even when it is something quieter than confidence. It is simply the ease of someone who has spent enough time with themselves to stop being a stranger to their own mind. Creativity is another area where people who prefer solitude tend to quietly excel. Research consistently links time alone with increased creative output. When you remove the noise of other people's opinions and expectations, the brain begins to make connections it would not otherwise have space to make. Writers, composers, painters, and inventors throughout history have often described solitude not as a retreat from the world, but as the very condition that made their best work possible. The quiet is not emptiness. For the person who has learned to inhabit it well, the quiet is where everything interesting happens. Their inner world is not a waiting room. It is a workshop. And the reason people who prefer solitude protect that space so fiercely is that they understand what happens to the quality of their thinking when it is constantly interrupted. The ideas thin out. The clarity dissolves. The creative momentum breaks. They are not being antisocial when they guard their alone time. They are being protective of the conditions that make them most fully themselves. There is also a fascinating and somewhat counterintuitive relationship between preferring solitude and higher levels of intelligence. A study published in the British Journal of Psychology examined intelligence, friendship frequency, and life satisfaction across a large adult sample. Its striking finding was that more intelligent individuals reported lower life satisfaction the more frequently they socialized with friends. While most people generally feel happier spending more time with friends, this pattern weakened significantly among those with higher cognitive ability. Researchers suggested that highly intelligent people may be less dependent on social interaction because they are more adept at pursuing long-term goals through solitary effort. They are less likely to need external validation to feel that their time is being used well. This does not mean intelligent people are cold or unfriendly. What it means is that they tend to value depth over breadth when it comes to connection. They are not collecting acquaintances. They are not interested in the performance of friendship. They are building something more durable, and they are willing to be misunderstood in the process. Now let us talk about what happens to someone like this when they grow up in a world that was structured entirely around the needs of social people. From early childhood, the message is consistent and loud. Make friends, be friendly, speak up. Do not sit alone at lunch. Join the group. Be a team player. Every institution from school to the workplace operates on the assumption that social engagement is not just healthy but mandatory. Children who naturally prefer solitude often grow up with a quiet but persistent sense that something is wrong with them. They spend years performing an extroverted version of themselves that does not quite fit and that costs them enormous energy to maintain. Researchers have found that this ongoing performance carries a real psychological cost. It can erode self-esteem over time, generate low-grade anxiety, and make a person feel fundamentally out of step with the world around them. And this is one of the saddest truths about rarely socializing people. It is often not the solitude itself that causes them difficulty. It is the shame the world taught them to attach to it. Research on adolescence supports this powerfully. Studies have found that the capacity to enjoy solitude is actually associated with healthier identity development during the teenage years. While many adolescents struggle intensely with the question of who they are because they are so caught up in the social mirror of their peers, young people who spend meaningful time alone have more opportunity to develop an interior life that belongs entirely to them. They are not just a reflection of the group, they are building something from the inside out. And the results often only become visible in adulthood, when the people who always needed a crowd to feel alive suddenly find themselves lost the moment the crowd disappears. But the person who learned to sit with themselves, who built an inner world worth inhabiting, they do not fall apart when the noise stops. They exhale. They know who they are when no one is watching, and that kind of knowing is something no amount of socializing can manufacture. It is worth addressing the concern that choosing solitude must inevitably lead to isolation and poor health. This fear is not entirely unfounded. Research has clearly established that chronic, unwanted loneliness carries serious health risks. But the key word is unwanted. A study published in Scientific Reports found that the harmful effects typically associated with spending a lot of time alone were significantly reduced or eliminated when that solitude was chosen rather than imposed. When people freely chose their time alone, it did not carry the emotional weight of loneliness. It carried something much closer to rest. The science is now drawing a firm line between the two experiences. Loneliness is a social pain signal, the mind alerting you that something it needs is missing. Solitude, in its positive form, is the opposite of that signal. It is the quiet felt sense that you are exactly where you want to be, in the company you most want to keep, which happens to be your own. People who rarely socialize also tend to show up differently in the relationships they do choose to invest in, and this is where many assumptions about them collapse completely. Because they are selective and because they have spent so much time with their own thoughts, they often come to connection with a level of presence and emotional attentiveness that is genuinely rare. They listen well. They notice things. They remember details that other people let slip through. They are not distracted by the noise of maintaining a wide social network. Their attention is focused, and when it lands on someone, it lands fully. A 2023 study published in Health Psychology Open found that highly introverted people who believed they would not benefit from socializing actually reported higher levels of happiness after social connections than extroverted people. Not because they socialized more, but because when they did, they were completely present for it. The rarity of the experience made them more alive to it. And that intentionality is not a limitation. It is a form of deep respect for the people they choose to let in. Finally, the most important thing to understand about people who rarely socialize is that they are not missing something. They are not waiting to be rescued from their own nature. They are not secretly desperate for someone to come along and show them what they have been missing. For the most part, they already know what they want. What they often need more than anything is for the world to stop treating their way of being as a problem and to start recognizing it as a legitimate, deeply human way to live. Because the science now supports what they have quietly known all along. You do not have to fill every silence with noise. You do not have to fill every hour with other people. You do not have to be the most connected person in the room to be the most whole. Sometimes the person sitting alone at the edge of the room, the one everyone assumes is struggling, is the one who has figured out something the rest of us are still working toward. They have learned to be enough company for themselves. And in a world that never stops shouting, that kind of inner quiet is not a weakness. It is one of the rarest and most underrated strengths a person can have. Social media has added an entirely new dimension to this pressure in recent years. The rise of platforms built on visibility, connection counts, and constant sharing created a new layer of expectation on people who were already working hard to make peace with preferring solitude. Suddenly, the question was no longer just whether you went to parties, but whether you were documenting enough of your life online to prove you were living it properly. For people who naturally pull back from social performance, this digital shift was disorienting and exhausting. But something interesting has been happening more recently. As conversations about boundaries and emotional self-care have entered the mainstream, the idea that choosing quiet is a valid and even wise way to live has begun to find more cultural space. The narrative is slowly shifting, and the science, as we have seen throughout this conversation, has been ready to support that shift for a long time.